Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians around the world. Today is Thursday, October 16th, 2025. This episode of Krynytsia is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is Peter Dickinson, who is editor of the Atlantic Council's Ukraine Alert blog and also chief editor of Business Ukraine magazine. Welcome, Peter. How are you?
Hi, I'm well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
And thanks for joining us today. To start off with, can you tell our audience a bit about your educational and professional background?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'm British, and I studied history at university in Liverpool, and then when I graduated, I was appointed by the British Council to Ukraine. So this was at the end of the 1990s. I came to Ukraine then, when the country was still, in the early stages of the post-Soviet transition, let's say. And I was very quickly very captivated by the country, and I've stayed ever since. So I've moved through a variety of different roles. I moved out of international relations or diplomacy into the media, and I've been working in the English language media pretty much consistently since the turn of the millennium. I've run a lot of different print publications, some television stations, and at the moment I am the editor for the Atlantic Council's Ukraine coverage, and also the editor publisher of Business Ukraine magazine.
Peter, can you tell our audience what is the Atlantic Council's Ukraine Alert blog and how does it contribute to the overall media coverage of Ukraine and the Russian invasion?
Well, the Atlantic Council is a Washington D.C. based think tank. It dates back to the JFK presidency in the early 1960s, and it was established to strengthen transatlantic ties during the Cold War. And so there's always been an accent on Ukraine, the former Soviet world, and the development of democracy in this part of the world, the reform processes and so on, and also the sort of broader geopolitical issues, primarily relating to Russia, but not exclusively. So that's always been the Atlantic Council, one of the Atlantic Council's focuses. And since 2014, when the Russian invasion of Crimea, of Ukraine began with the siege of Crimea, there's been a specific accent on Ukraine itself. So what I do at the Ukraine Alert platform is to publish every single week around 5 or 6 articles highlighting different aspects of Ukraine's sort of national journey, the latest news, some broader analysis, and in relation to the war, of course, not necessarily sort of blow by blow news reports, but more analysis on different aspects of it. So the diplomatic aspects of it, Ukraine's nation building efforts, Russia's war crimes, the genocidal nature of the invasion, to sort of bring home to international audiences the broader context of what this war is all about, rather than just offering a sort of here and now news analysis, but trying to add a little bit of depth.
In the July 30, 2025 issue of the blog, you wrote an article about what is happening to Ukrainians in the Russian-occupied regions of the country. Please share with us some of the key takeaways from this article.
Well, this is an issue that I think has been underreported, and so it's something I try to highlight as often as I can. We often hear talk about territorial concessions from Ukraine's side, from accepting Russian occupation, discussions about where borders should be, where frozen front lines of the conflict should be. And it kind of gets forgotten that we're talking about millions and millions of people here who are living under occupation, and the horrors that they're enduring on a daily basis. So this is really something that I think needs to be highlighted from a humanitarian point of view. What's happening there is I think is almost beyond description. I mean, it's incredibly shocking for modern audiences. It reads like something almost medieval, or perhaps from the totalitarian 20th century. What we're talking about here is mass arrests and detentions of people before they've committed crimes, those who are suspected of perhaps posing a threat. So Typically, the Russians will round up anyone they feel could pose a threat to their occupation regime. So it's local officials, members of the media, activists, cultural figures, religious leaders, those who are engaged in anything that could be considered like patriotic or Ukrainian, maybe Ukrainian language teachers, for example, and of course, military veterans. These people are rounded up, and frankly, we don't know what's happened to a lot of these people. We don't know how many have been affected, and we don't know where they are. The great fear, of course, is many of them actually are no longer with us, that they are dead now. Those who are not are languishing in dungeons and prisons, God knows where. So this is a major issue that's really not fully appreciated by international audiences. The United Nations, to its credit, has actually raised this issue and acknowledged that these mass detentions are a crime against humanity. But even so, we don't hear enough reportage about this amid all these discussions about possible negotiations, peace deals, compromises, and so on. So that's one aspect. And I think the other key aspect would be the fact that those who remain in occupied Ukraine are being subjected to a very, very severe form of Russification, essentially Ukrainian national identity in all of its guises, cultural, linguistic, the whole heritage of Ukraine is being systematically erased. So we're talking about a very concerted attempt by the Kremlin to extinguish any notion of Ukrainian identity. And again, this is something that international audiences do not really appreciate. They think that this war is somehow, well, not that they, I mean, that's probably too broad a brush, but many people still regard this war as some sort of a geopolitical game or a power struggle or a contest, a proxy war between the West and Russia about territory, about spheres of influence. But in actual fact, what we see happening on the ground in occupied East Ukraine is a form, in my opinion, a form of genocide. It's a very clear and methodical plan to erase Ukraine entirely. We're talking about around 20% of Ukraine here. I see no reason to doubt that Russia would apply exactly the same logic and exactly the same criminal methods to any other territory they were able to acquire and control. So if they were able to control all of Ukraine, they would do the same. If it was slightly more, or if they were able to seize other big cities, the pattern has already been established. So I think it's crucial for international audiences to understand that when we talk about genocide, and when we talk about the erasure of Ukrainian identity, these are not ideas. This is not speculation. It's already happening every day in the areas that Russia already controls. So we really have pretty conclusive proof that this is the Russian agenda, and this is what we'll see elsewhere unless they're stopped.
And how does Russian President Putin justify his attempt to erase the Ukrainian nation?
Well, Putin's quite explicit when he talks about his conquests. First of all, he talks about them in those terms. He has used the term conquests. He also often refers to them as historically Russian lands. So he's moving for. Putin's argument would be that the Ukrainian identity has been imposed on these territories. They're actually Russian, and they've always been Russian, and they should return to being Russian. That's how he justifies it to his own domestic audience. And Putin's, he speaks quite openly about this. He says routinely, these are historically Russian lands. There was a very revealing little incident in one of his press events in the summer, I believe it was. I believe it was at the Economic Forum in St. Petersburg, where he was discussing Ukraine, and he very casually, just sort of flippantly said, "Well, of course, all of Ukraine is ours," and the entire auditorium sort of broke out into spontaneous sniggers and laughs and applause. So this is something that the Russian people are very, very familiar with. This is not shocking for them. If anyone else, any world leader were to stand up and say, just routinely that entire country is actually ours, it would be at the very least shocking. Many people would find it disturbing or repugnant, but it would shock. But in this case, I think it was very, very revealing that the audience, they laughed. They thought it was kind of, just Putin being Putin, but also a routine thing. They're very familiar with the idea that this war is about eradicating Ukraine as a nation, not just as a state, but as a nation. And they're quite comfortable with that fact. So from a Russian point of view, as shocking as this is to us, it's not shocking to them at all. They're well aware of it. And I think a lot of them, if they, a lot of them support it, and those who don't support it, you kind of shrug and say, "Well, it is what it is. That's what Russia is. Russia is an empire, and that's what we do."
Given this situation, do you think Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky would cede any of the occupied territories to Russia in return for immediate peace?
But when we're talking about territorial concessions, we've got to be very careful here and very specific. Zelensky has already said that he's ready to accept the long-term occupation of areas currently under Russian control. Essentially, he said that it's not feasible at the current reality, as it were. It's not feasible to militarily liberate the entire country, and he's been saying that consistently for over a year now. So, the immediate answer would be yes, he's ready to acknowledge that, but acknowledging occupation is not the same as ceding territory. I think that while Zelensky's ready to acknowledge that Russia will control these territories for the long term, perhaps even for the foreseeable future, he will not cede a single inch. And I think in that sense, that's not just a legal sort of detail. That's a very, very important, distinction to make. Because as soon as you start officially ceding territory, you're essentially redrawing the map of Europe by force. Zelensky understands that if he starts to do that, that will only encourage Russia, that will only embolden Putin, that would essentially legitimize his entire invasion, and it would encourage further aggression. But I think also on a broader sense, the international community would not condone that. Even if Zelensky were, for whatever reason, to say, I recognize it, the international community, I think, would say, well, we don't recognize it, because this is a much more fundamental principle at stake here. If we look at the world order as it stood, let's say in 2022, or perhaps even going back to 2014, stretching back to the post-World War II era, the most fundamental sort of foundational pillar of the world order is that you cannot change borders by force. So that really is an absolute matter of principle for not just Ukraine, but for the entire international community. So yes, Russia can retain control potentially over the areas it currently occupies in some sort of a peace settlement, but it will never, in my opinion, gain official sanction, and i.e., to redraw the map and to have those territories officially ceded to Russia.
Is there any active Ukrainian resistance movement in the Russian occupied territories? And if so, is it possible that it will succeed in liberating this area?
Yeah, there's a very active resistance throughout the areas that are occupied by Russia in Ukraine. There's also an active resistance within Russia itself. They're engaged primarily in acts of sabotage and also in cooperation with the Ukrainian armed forces, the Ukrainian intelligence, and providing support for larger scale operations that are carried out by the Ukrainians in occupied territory and in Russia. So they're quite active. But is it realistic for them to liberate the territory? Well, no, it's not at all realistic, and that's actually not exceptional. I don't think any resistance movement in the history of the world has ever liberated a country. They can disrupt, they can aid, an army of liberation, for example, as we saw during World War II, when the invasion force, the Western invasion of Nazi Europe, Nazi occupied Europe, was aided by resistance movements in France and in Belgium and in Holland and so on. But I don't think it's realistic to expect these very small numbers, essentially, to have a major impact on the war. But they are active. I think the main role they play, sabotage is important, but the main role they play is in terms of the intelligence they can provide, which is something that is, for obvious reasons, not much talked about, but is quite significant.
Peter, we're just about out of time, but I do have two final questions for you. First, what does the average Ukrainian think about the situation in the occupied territories? And are they willing to cede them to Russia in return for peace? And secondly, has the U.S. shown any understanding of the situation in the Russian occupied territories and the impact for Ukraine long term as an independent nation?
Well, I think Ukrainians are horrified by what's going on in the occupied regions, and they're well aware of it. And the information that comes out there is limited. But people here, of course, in Ukraine, are much more conscious of that than the broader international audience. And it is, of course, a source of great distress. You often see Ukrainians Many Ukrainians are from those regions. Many fled those regions either in the very early stages of the war, or perhaps even before then. Or perhaps they have family there, or they did have family there, or they grew up there. For example, there are many people in Kiev, for example, where I am, from the East Ukrainian regions that Russia occupied in 2014. Who've been living now in Kiev for the last 10 years or so, but they still, that's still their home. They still have great nostalgia for Donetsk and Lugansk and areas at Mariupol, especially as well. Also, it's a very, very painful issue for Ukrainians. The information that we have in terms of polling and opinion is that Ukrainians are broadly in line with Zelensky's position, that they recognise that they're ready to accept the long-term occupation of these regions just out of a matter of pragmatism, because they understand that that's the reality. But they will not cede it. There's very little support publicly for handing territories over to Russia. So, broadly, the same position that Zelensky himself has articulated. They don't see that as an option. They see that as a very, very dangerous thing to entertain. So I don't think that would be the case. But certainly the humanitarian issue of those suffering under occupation is a major sort of national tragedy, and something that causes great distress. In terms of the Americans, I think that this is something that there's not, the American administration not hugely aware of what's going on in the occupied regions. Much like the international community, more broadly, I don't think it's something that really that has really registered so much. There are certain things that they are aware of. I think the widespread, the massive sort of Russian campaign of abductions of Ukrainian children has really struck a chord with Americans and international audiences. The First Lady, Melania Trump, has personally taken an interest in the fate of these abducted children. I think because that crime is so horrific, is so sort of mind-bogglingly evil, that has really struck a chord with Americans, and that's something that's helped raise awareness of the broader issues going on there in occupied Ukraine. The other issue, I think, which is starting to resonate more and more with American audiences, is the issue of religious oppression under Russian occupation. Now, the Russians have essentially outlawed any form of Christianity other than the Russian Orthodox Church itself, which of course is very, very deeply linked to Putin, to the Putin regime, and to the war. It's been very, very openly supportive of the war, has called it a holy war, even essentially. So what we're seeing in the occupied regions is the oppression, and in many cases the murder of congregations, of individual priests. There have been many priests are among those who've been abducted, have been subjected to torture, and some have been killed, and that's across the board. We're talking here about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. We're talking about Catholics, Protestants, evangelicals, other religious denominations. So that is something that, for American audiences in particular, I think, who tend to be more religious than European audiences, much more religious, I would say, and again, particularly on the American right, particularly within the MAGA camp and in the Bible Belt and so forth, that resonates with them very loudly, and that has been. I think that's the more aware of that they become, the stronger their support for Ukraine becomes. So I think that these twin issues, the religious oppression of non-Russian Orthodox Christians and the mass abduction of children, have both helped to raise awareness about what is going on in Russian occupied Ukraine. But of course, it's really the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more going on there in terms of the criminality, and again, coming back to this original point, the broader picture of the destruction of Ukrainian national identity. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of raising awareness about these issues, but awareness is growing.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us today on Krynytsia.
Thanks for having me.
I have been speaking with Peter Dickinson, editor of the Atlantic Council's Ukraine Alert blog and chief editor of Business Ukraine magazine. This podcast has been produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. And I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia. Until next time, that's all for now.